Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's ContainerJournal.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong and Rafay Systems. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead, but first I have a couple of housekeeping notes. First off, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live webinar today. If you have any questions for our speakers, we'd like you to direct those to the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. That's also where you'll find the chat tab where you can engage with your fellow audience members. Finally, at the conclusion of our webinar, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. So our topic today is Kubernetes Lessons from the Trenches, a panel discussion. And I'm joined today by Haseeb Budhani, CEO and co-founder of Rafay Systems, Bruce Blaho, HP Fellow and VP Chief Technologist, Advanced Compute and Solutions at HP, and Adnan Kahn, Enterprise Architect at MoneyGram International. It's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Haseeb, but thank you all three of you for coming and talking with me today.
Thank you, Cody. The $25 gift cards, I guess we'll use MoneyGram to transfer that money to everybody who wins. Yes, we'll see that at the end of the show. But hello, everybody. My name is Haseeb, as Cody mentioned. I'll be driving this conversation today. This should be a really fun conversation because, the two gentlemen who are joining me today, they come at the Kubernetes operations problem from very different but interesting lenses. Adnan, who's with MoneyGram, his focus is making sure his company is really successful as it relates to modernization. And he spends all his time thinking about the developer experience, and we talk a lot about that. And on the other hand, Bruce is coming from a very traditional hardware manufacturing company who has figured out how and where HP can help their customers modernize their stack so they can deliver better services to their end customers faster. So I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. And with that, I'm going to switch to the slide just so my colleagues here can introduce themselves also and also call out the things they want to talk about. Bruce, would you mind describing to the group here what your role is with HP and what are you excited about when it comes to Kubernetes?
Yeah, thanks, Haseeb. So I'm Bruce Blaho with HP. As Haseeb said, we're the part of HP I work in, the Advanced Compute and Solutions. Our traditional core business has been workstations, so we've helped technical professionals with computing. But over the last few years, my job as chief technologist is to be discovering the new stuff and driving new growth areas. And what we discovered is the growth of data science and AI and explosion of data at the edge has really led to quite an opportunity and a need for edge computing. So heavy compute AI inference happening at on-prem and at edge locations outside of data centers. The natural way to implement that, the most popular way to implement that is using Kubernetes, using modern software techniques, using containerized software. And so we've been, over the last few years, trying to understand, what the customers are trying to do, what are the needs, and what's the best way that HP can help them with that.
Excellent. Thank you, Bruce. And Adnan, would you mind introducing yourself also and your role at MoneyGram?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Haseeb. So hi, everyone. My name is Adnan Kahn. I'm Enterprise Architect with MoneyGram. So MoneyGram, as most of you know, we're a payments company. We're a global money transfer, one of the leading providers of money transfer services, P2P, person to person. We transact in over 250 countries. Traditionally, we are brick and mortar. You go into a MoneyGram location and do a money transfer, or you can use our online apps across the globe. So what I do at MoneyGram is a few years ago, we started this whole modernization journey to a microservices architecture. I would say almost about 3-4 years ago, was sort of when Kubernetes was sort of just coming up, becoming more mainstream. At that time, we also made a decision to sort of adopt public cloud and look at Kubernetes as sort of our orchestration platform for hosting these microservices. So I've been kind of leading that effort, that modernization effort to Kubernetes. How do we, so that we can essentially scale, we can, respond quickly. The sort of this whole pandemic in the last couple of years, our digital transformation has skyrocketed, right? I mean, less people going to actually brick and mortar stores and more people transacting online. So it's become essential for us to sort of respond quickly. Microservices has helped us, but where we were struggling was, how do we scale these microservices? That's kind of where Kubernetes comes in. So kind of leading that journey. We're not fully there yet, but we're on a good path forward. So.
Great. So maybe I'll start with a question for you then, Adnan. How did you convince the developer community at MoneyGram that this is important and we got to take this new path? Talk about that a little bit. How was that journey?
Yeah, and that was actually pretty easy, Haseeb, because if you take Kubernetes out of the mix, right, and you start looking at, okay, 5 years ago, if I had moved to a microservices architecture, what are my options for scaling, right? I mean, there was a limited tool set essentially. You could use, for example, the Spring Cloud projects, right, or the Netflix projects that you could use to do high availability. But it was really hard for some of those cloud native concepts, right, like auto scaling, the ability to sort of deploy, automated pipelines. So we struggled. We tried to go with that model on-prem, and we really struggled. I mean, we were not able to sort of do it at scale, right? So when you have 5-10 microservices, it's super easy to manage. What happens when you go from 50 to 100, and then you're managing them without sort of an orchestration platform, and you realize, right, our ability to respond to issues, our stability was being impacted, and that's kind of where we started looking at Kubernetes and some of the benefits that it gave us. So it was actually a pretty easy, sell for the developer community. There were other challenges from an adoption perspective because Kubernetes obviously brings a lot of complexities to the table, but from an operational, from a reliability perspective, it was a pretty easy sell.
Bruce, you see this problem play out across many customers because you see customers who probably start by saying, I don't know, I don't need this right now. And then they change their minds. What are you seeing? When do people say, wow, this is something I really need to think about? What transition are you seeing?
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what we've been seeing. Most of the customers and solution providers we're talking to are focused on, their solution. We work with a lot of, I'll use a lot of examples from retail. I think they're familiar. We see a lot of folks trying to deliver, say, computer vision based solutions at the edge, a frictionless checkout system for a grocery store, or visual analytics, counting people with masks on, things like that. They're very focused on the solution as they should be. And so the platform that they're running on, though, something that they needed to build, so they did it themselves. And when they started probably a few years ago, there really weren't very many or any commercial solutions available. So they've cobbled together, maybe a Kubernetes stack of their own, or maybe they're using something that they found somewhere. But they're very focused on piloting and getting the solution to work. And so a lot of times when we talk to these customers, they're in the stage where I have this running at a dozen locations, or maybe a few dozen, a handful. And they're like, no, I'm pretty good. I know what to do. And so what we tend to do is then sort of walk through, okay, now imagine that you're successful, right? We want you to be successful. As they start to scale and start thinking about, what happens when you get to 100 stores, 1,000 stores, 10,000 stores. We have customers today, some of the quick service restaurants, may have thousands of locations, maybe even tens of thousands of locations. And so it usually isn't until they start to seriously think about scaling that they get interested in talking to us. It usually goes through a progression of, I'm not worried about that yet, to, yeah, okay, I see the problem, but I'll do some of my own stuff. I don't need to buy that from anybody, to, oh my gosh, even if I could figure this out for myself, I wouldn't want to. This is going to consume me. And so we have to be sometimes a little patient and wait for them to get to where okay, now I see if I'm going to do this at scale, then I'm going to need help.
Excellent. So then that begs the question, if my focus is modernization and I care about the app first, at what point do I care about the infrastructure, Adnan, and how did that play out for your team?
I'm sorry, was that to me or to Anand?
Adnan. Yeah.
Anand, yeah.
About the infrastructure, Haseeb?
Yeah, I mean, when did you guys decide this? Okay, I guess I got to go past my application and really think about this infrastructure layer.
Yeah. So, you know, that was one of the key things, right? I mean, it's initially it's pretty straightforward, but when you start thinking of day two, and you start looking at public cloud, there's all these different concerns, right? Is how do we get ourselves to that position where we're doing more automation? Now, again, coming from us on-prem and going to sort of Kubernetes, it's a learning curve, right? There's for our ops people, for our SREs, for our devs. And that's when we started looking at, hey, you know, what can be used to sort of simplify this for ourselves, to do more automation, right? You know, and that's kind of why we were working with you, Haseeb, and your team, to really take that burden off. You know, we're not a very large company. We have a certain amount of engineering resources. We need to scale pretty quickly, right? If we were going to go live with a lot of these initiatives. So that's essentially what kind of led us down that path to do more on the infrastructure side as well.
Yeah. So staying with the developer pre-infrastructure, then could you talk a little bit about what are you doing exactly to truly improve the developer experience as it relates to Kubernetes? Are you hiding it entirely from them? Are you exposing it to them a little bit? Are you training them? How does that play out?
Yeah, so great question, Haseeb. So initially when we started out, we basically said, okay, so if you go back to how people on-prem were doing it, it's traditional VMs. You've got a jar file. We are predominantly a Java shop. We have some .NET as well. But people are very used to running things locally within their instance, right? Now you're containerizing it, so you've got a Docker file. Now you're deploying it to Kubernetes, so you've got Helm charts, you've got values files, right? You've got deployment YAMLs, you've got service YAMLs, you've got load balance, you've got HPAs. And we realized pretty quickly that model was not going to scale because, again, as in with most companies, right, we have a good mix of, we have modern, Spring Boot Java, but we also have a lot of traditional EJB type applications, right? So there's a fair amount of cognitive overload, right? So I think what we had to do was realize pretty quickly that if we're going to scale and if we're going to accelerate, we really need to do some things around automation, around acceleration, with the sort of onboarding concept, right? So to give you an example, some of the things that we did was we obviously use Helm, for packaging our Kubernetes applications. But we created what we call starter charts. So we have Helm starter charts for Spring Boot applications. We have starter charts for .NET. We have starter charts for anything that is batch. So developers have a template essentially that they can basically build from. We provide all the defaults. We provide sensible defaults so they don't have to think about, hey, what is my readiness probe going to look like, right? What should be my resource? We set some very sensible defaults for them so they can hit the ground running essentially, take it from our Artifactory, from our Helm repo, and basically just deploy it without writing any custom artifacts. We did the same thing with Dockerfile. And eventually we took it to, Java Maven gives you the concept of an archetype, which is basically a templating. So even for our Spring Boot apps that are running natively on Kubernetes, we provide a lot of that boilerplate infrastructure setup, things like config map, how you do secrets within a Spring Boot app, right? Mm. We've done that all for them. So you basically create an archetype and you get a starter app that is good to go, and you can literally just deploy it in 2 to 3 commands, and you've got it running on your Kubernetes cluster. It took us a while to get there because initially it wasn't all there. There was a lot of stuff that was in code, and we had developers that were essentially coming to us and say, hey, what are all these separate concerns that are now in my code that I need to worry about, right? Mm-hmm. So another thing that we did was we completely separated, best practices, separating your config from code, right? It's always been there, but it becomes even more important as you're sort of going to this cloud native deployment model, right? Completely separating those concerns where my developer can still run their application locally outside of a Kubernetes context. But then if they want to deploy to a Kubernetes cluster, they can use all these tooling that we've done to streamline, automate, and do it. So that has come a long ways in our ability to both standardize and accelerate.
Wow, so you made a pretty significant investment to come up with these sort of standards that you could share within the organization. Maybe at some point you may consider open sourcing the frameworks that you've built, Adnan. That could help a lot of other shops, I'm sure. Just something to think about.
Absolutely, yeah. We've been thinking, we were trying to get it stable and make sure that we have good adoption before. But it has worked. It has really helped us accelerate when we started with the sort of, hey, let's make it completely transparent and give everybody what they need. It became overwhelming, right? And adoption was low. Because again, that everyone's going to have that same cloud native mindset, right? So
that's great. No, that's awesome, right? That you were able to kind of step back and think about these trend lines and come up with a solution that helps developers move faster. But then on the other side of the I guess spectrum, Bruce, your customers. I mean, let's just pick the retail vertical, right? And not like everybody who may buy from you. If we had to think about some sort of a trend line for what they're doing at the edge, what's your sense? Like, what's actually going on? Everybody talks about edge. Right. It's sort of confusing. Is it telco? Is it like a Raspberry Pi? I don't really know what you're talking about. Right. So what is an edge, and what are they running there?
Yeah, no, great question. So what we say, like say for instance in retail. So let's think about say grocery stores, restaurants. It's all about trying to automate the store and digitize the store. Coming out of COVID and the Great Resignation, a lot of these businesses are struggling to get enough staff, and the staff they've got, they want to be really focused on the customers, and so they're trying to automate some of the more mundane tasks, and they're also trying to do things like go to more touchless, more automated systems, things like frictionless checkout, automating drive-through lines. Drive-through lines are still remarkably much far below where the restaurants would like to be in terms of order accuracy. Maybe in the 80s, and so that's where we see a lot of investment, and so that almost all of those applications then tend to be based around AI, whether it's computer vision, to say have some cameras that are monitoring the drive-through line that can tell the restaurant how many people are in line. Is that next car coming up a minivan or a sports car? Make some guesses about what are we going to be selling in the next 20 minutes? And so we see a lot of that, a lot of sensors, a lot of cameras, some natural language processing to do things like order taking at the drive-through. And what's interesting and what's really struck us, I think, at HP is the maturity in the market right now is that there are many silos that exist. So what I mean by that is there are a bunch of startups out there, some big companies, but a lot of startups will say, hey, I have this great AI-based solution that will do whatever, that will take orders, at your drive-through line, or will do frictionless checkout in your grocery store, or will, count customers and see how long the lines are and raise alerts, when you need to open a new line, or tell you how many burgers to put on the griddle, for the next 20 minutes. The problem is that they all show up and they say, I've got this solution, and then here's the compute that it's going to run on, and they have their own computers, and that's not sustainable. So we're in a very unsustainable track right now, in that I can't have a whole vertical solution for each of these things. And eventually we think, my view is I think these stores and restaurants will want to be running dozens and dozens of different services. And so I can't have, 5, 6, a dozen different computers to run them. And so I think what's needed, and I think the void that HP is trying to fill, is how do we create, more of a compute platform, a scalable platform, that can live at these locations. These locations are very different than, say, an enterprise data center, right? You'll have, we talked about, tens of thousands of locations, typically a modest amount of compute, small clusters, maybe 1 to half a dozen nodes per store, but there's no IT staff there, right? So it's not like a data center where I've got a whole staff of IT experts there to tend to these. The store may be run by a teenager, maybe an 18-year-old that's in charge tonight, at this restaurant. And so there's such a premium around automation, remote management, making it seamless. And so anybody that's tried to bring up a Kubernetes system on-prem or at the edge knows this is a very complicated business. And so we see a pretty big opportunity to try to simplify, automate, and make this edge compute problem into more of a turnkey, both to get started the day one, and I like Adnan put it, then what's the day two problem? What do I do ongoing year after year as I'm trying to maintain and expand services at all these locations? So it's a really fascinating problem. It's not like traditional data center server computing. It's not like traditional PC computing. It really is a whole new flavor of compute. And therefore, there's a real void, I think, in the market for where are the tools. How are we gonna do this at scale in a manageable way?
Excellent. So it sounds like one trend line, as I think about, because this is a big problem, is maybe ML and NLP, because those are two kind of foundational elements for the applications that sounds like are running in these retail environments. And it's kind of funny, right? I mean, a lot of this stuff is, what's old is new again, right? When I had no white hair, I remember people talking about going from branch to the cloud.
Yeah.
And now I guess we're back in the branches, and Adnan's business, right? You guys have all these retail locations. I don't know, maybe at some point they're going to be looking at some of the solutions that Bruce and team are building. Wow, that's fascinating. Anything that you're doing, Bruce, as it relates to the applications themselves, the ML, the NLP, right? So there's some trend lines there around kind of GPU, et cetera. Anything that you guys are thinking about to assist your customer base as they deploy applications at the edge?
Yeah, we're trying to figure out, both what are the tools that the end customers need, just say the owner and the people operating, say, the grocery store or the restaurant, as well as the developers, who are the people that are creating the solutions. And so I mentioned, targeting the developers, to have a platform so they don't have to worry about the hardware and managing all of this. And we're also looking at and developing some tools for them around computer vision. And a lot of these are computer vision related and AI acceleration for these AI based operations, mostly inferencing, sometimes some training. What's the most efficient way to operate those and accelerate those kind of applications. So it really is changing the kind of computers that we build. So for instance, for computer vision, today that tends to be more GPU driven. And so the new boxes we're building tend to allocate more of the resources to more GPUs and not as much CPU. I'm sorry, Intel. But right now, the trend is towards more GPU based compute. So the new boxes we're building, they have one CPU and one CPU and 4 GPUs, and instead of the other way around. And then I think the other big area of investment for us that we're looking at is security. So how do people, you're deploying in these highly non-secure locations, and so trying to build everything out with zero trust. We're modifying our supply chains to be able to basically identify and track systems all the way from the factory, so that when they arrive in this machine every day, when this machine shows up on the network, how do we know that it's trustworthy? How do we know that somebody didn't do either something malicious or is just loading a Bitcoin miner onto that? When we first started exploring Kubernetes inside HP, it was pretty somewhat funny. The first 100 or so Kubernetes deployments we had, we found in a matter of weeks, they all were running rogue Bitcoin miners. So you learn pretty quickly that sometimes people are trying to steal data and do something malicious. Other times they're just trying to steal cycles. So being able to secure against not only, tampering with the hardware, phantom workloads, certifying all that. So those are all the sorts of things we're trying to do to let the developers focus on their magic, their innovation, and let the store owners and the operators focus on their business and get the rest of this edge stuff out of the way so they don't have to worry about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and by the way, side plug, everybody should be running OPA Gatekeeper or equivalent Kubernetes maybe on their Kubernetes clusters, and our solution does provide that. Everybody should do this, because the advent of bad code that goes out and grabs like a Bitcoin miner from Docker Hub and runs it on your machine, the pace at which that is happening is actually quite shocking. And people are just stealing compute, right? It's not really about stealing information for the most part, because they can make more money that way by mining coins. So everybody should be cognizant of that. So now, if I may tie that back to Adnan, some of the work you're thinking about. So let's say tomorrow, leadership at MoneyGram says, you know what, we're going to go deploy applications in our brick and mortar locations, because at some point that may happen for a better experience in the store. Wow. So the number of clusters that you now have to address, it goes from whatever it is now, right? Let's say I'm making up a number of 10, right, to 10,000, right? So it's a 3 orders of magnitude more. How are you going to debug these things? Like, what's the observability strategy? What's the tracing strategy? How do you think about that?
Yeah, and that's not a far-fetched question, because we are a global company. We are providing more in-store experiences, be it via kiosk or what have you. So that's something certainly that we're looking at, Haseeb, to go. Right now, I would say we're more of a centralized platform, across availability zones and stuff, but we are going geographically, edge is something in the works, right? So
excellent.
Your question about observability, that's a really important one too, right? Because, again, when you go to Kubernetes, you've got all these control plane elements, you've got logs, you've got, we struggled with that initially also. It's like, there's so many tools out there, right? If you look at the CNC landscape, you find a gazillion, obviously the Prometheuses and the Grafanas and the what have you. Our strategy has been always to go for managed solutions, because again, we need that support for day 2. So we've been looking at things of, our strategy has been kind of less is more along those fronts, right? So what can we use that can give us seamless sort of observability, give the goal metric, right? And like latency, error rates, without us really going and having built a lot of dashboards and stuff, without us putting like Istio or service mesh, another component, right? So we've been looking at things like Pixie. Pixie is part of CNCF, was contributed to New Relic. We are a partner with New Relic, but we love the simplicity that Pixie gives you from a minimally invasive, and gives you all those metrics all the way from your cluster level down to your namespace, to your service, to your pod, to your JVM, right? Without me doing any sort of custom instrumentation, without you using any libraries. So that has been kind of our strategy, is to kind of, what can we use that minimally invasive, not a lot of engineering, but also gives us solid metrics, right? So, so for logging, we use some other platforms, Splunk's out there and there's other tools, but really standardize on that set of tools, right? Instead of having many, go for a few managed options that can help us, scale also and support us when we do need it.
Yeah. It's as I think about the sort of the drag of modern applications on the tooling that needs to come along, right? I personally, this is my day job, is to talk about this stuff, right? And it's so hard for me to keep track of all the technologies that exist out there, right? So today we're talking about Pixie. Yesterday I was in a conversation with somebody, and they talked about tools that I haven't even heard about. Right? They were talking about this layer that sits on top of service meshes, and it sort of abstracts Istio and Linkerd, and I've never heard of this before. And I'm in the business and I can't keep up. Like, I can't keep up with all the technology that's going on, right? How do you do this? Like, how are you just tracking the entire ecosystem and making sure your developers then kind of, they don't need to hear all the raw data, but sort of passing that on to them, the things that they need to care about?
Yeah. So we intentionally seek to solve that problem, right? Because as you go into the cloud native scans, and if you look at the CNCF landscape, right, I think you just look at that chart and that tells you. Right?
Yeah, it's crazy, right? How can anybody know all of this stuff? It's not possible.
Yeah. How do you adopt, right? I mean, Linkerd is now graduated status, but do you really want to introduce a service mesh, right? So initially in our journey, we were looking at those, right? Because when you look at a service mesh, for example, Istio, we looked at Istio extensively, and you're like, wow, it gives me observability. It gives me all this point-to-point mutual TLS. It gives me some elements of chaos engineering. It does that, but what does that introduce to you, right? From a complexity, right? You're basically trying to get your core apps stable. Now you've got another element. And again, going back to that sort of day two strategy is like, if something bad was to happen, where do you even start, right? So we have a team at MoneyGram that basically looks at a lot of these, our cloud migration journey, our cloud migration strategy. Hey, what are some of the most common problems that we need to solve for? It could be around observability. It could be around east-west traffic, mutual TLS, right? And then going out there and looking at, what does the CNCF offer? What does some managed solutions offer? Doing POCs, really working very closely with our development teams to see, hey, what would be a good fit for MoneyGram, right? Versus one team sort of just looking at endorsed standard and saying, hey, we think this will work out of the box, right? It's a very collaborative effort. We work closely with our app arcs to see what would work well within our ecosystem. We go through a round of POCs. We do extensive testing, not just hello world type stuff, but also really stress testing. Can you really scale with the growth that we're doing? And then in making a conscious decision, we adopt it or not.
Wow, so you guys have really thought about best practices, Adnan. I think it sounds like, man, at some point you should really be getting on a stage at the next KubeCon and talking about some of these things that you built here, right? So just from you talked earlier about the frameworks you built around Helm examples and, kind of simplifying config map usage, et cetera, in your company. How do you do secrets management? And now you're talking about you guys are always sort of keeping an eye out for new technologies that are coming out, and you keep doing POCs just to see what if something better exists. Let me go look at that. So that's a really healthy way to approach the problem. And I'm sure some people listening to this are probably thinking, wow, that's a pretty significant investment. I can speak from experience from other customers that if you don't do this, it actually costs more later. Right. So you guys are doing, it's great that you're doing all these right things. And I think, yeah, definitely at some point you should be, taking time to kind of educate others, right? Because the community works this way, right? As all of us have interacted and learned from each other, right? These are some great things you guys have learned. Let's find a way to disseminate this. Yeah.
Absolutely, right? If we can teach someone based on our lessons, and again, we don't get it right the first time, right? None of us do.
Yeah.
It's that journey, it's that iterative mindset, and then you get there, right? And we've made some decisions where you'd be like, was that a smart decision, right? But that's part of the learning process, right? So,
yeah. As I say, measure twice, cut once.
Yes.
So it's better to kind of think through it a little bit before you make these decisions. So then tying this back to the broader edge use case as well. So Bruce, you're at customers, they run stuff at the edge, but then look, everybody's got some backend in the cloud, right? And that's just how the modern stack works now. Even at the edge, there's the edges, but then there's the cloud. How are you seeing these tools play out as it relates to edge versus cloud? Are you seeing that it's all the same tools, it's different tool sets? How do your customers think about, AWS in the back versus edge in the front?
Yeah. So I have a tendency to talk a lot about edge computing. And when I say edge, what I really mean is hybrid edge cloud. Every solution we've ever worked on, has both elements of cloud and edge. We tend to gravitate to the solutions that are generating loads and loads of data at the edge, so they have to do at least some of the compute. But what we see as typical is, usually, they're rooted back in the cloud, right? So usually that's the source of truth. That's where the answers are going. A lot of the heavy lifting, in compute is happening at the edge. So maybe I've got, 100 cameras, in a store or a restaurant, and I'm doing real time, tracking of people, maybe 10 frames a second per camera. So there's a ton of inferencing happening, a ton of compute happening, but most of the brains usually then is back in the cloud. And usually that's where the central management is happening. Once I, for instance, tracked a customer and seen what they're buying, like say for a frictionless checkout system, then, their shopping cart and billing and everything is going to happen, happen back in the cloud. And so a couple things we figured out very early on, everybody, that's building these solutions, is using cloud. The people providing solutions, they're building these solutions are, from what I've seen, a 100% cloud agnostic, meaning they all are using the cloud, but none of them want to commit to whether it's Amazon or Azure. And a lot of them may be using probably Amazon or Azure, but they don't want to be tied. And so they definitely want to stay away from getting bound to the specific tools that are unique to only Azure or to only Amazon. And so that was one of the first things we figured out, is that if you're going to sell to and work with the people that are creating the solutions, and it's for good reason. You can understand, if I'm building a retail solution, I don't want to go to a store owner and say, hey, here's my solution, it's great. Oh, by the way, it requires that you're accessing Amazon or Azure. They may have an allergic reaction to that. And likewise, they don't want to be locked in to any of those solutions. So no lock-in is a really critical thing that we figured out pretty early on. So yes to cloud, but no to any particular, proprietary services on those clouds.
There's a question in the chat. I think it was asked at a specific point in time, and I apologize, participant 558. Your question is, how will it be an effective strategy for solving the complexity of Kubernetes? And I apologize, I don't exactly remember what we had discussed at that instant in time, but it does, I guess, underscore a specific question, which is, we haven't really spent time talking about the complexity of Kubernetes. We've sort of kind of kept this conversation to the left or to the right. Is Kubernetes complex, Adnan? I don't know. Is it?
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly right. So, and again, there's different elements, right? Haseeb, I think you're part about the whole operational infrastructure, your SRE, your DevOps. There's two sides of it. And then there's the data plane, right, where you have all your applications and the dev experience, right? So it is complex because there's just so many moving parts, right? And this is just bare bones Kubernetes, right? I mean, we're not even talking service mesh, and we're not talking about various components for observability and all those things, right? So it does take a fair amount, right? And you need partners and sort of managed providers that can help you on both those fronts, right? So.
Yeah, I do think about this a lot. Look, my day job, at one point in my past, I'm sure I was a reasonably good engineer that nobody remembers, but as we sell what we have to sell, man, this is so complex, and people are still looking at Kubernetes, so it must solve a real problem, right? I mean, it must be doing something materially useful. if you had to summarize, and Bruce, I'd like for you to think about this question, because Adnan is on the architecture side. Why do people look at Kubernetes, Bruce? What do you think? What's your summary?
Yeah, good question. And I remember a few years ago, the first time we went to stand up our first Kubernetes cluster at the edge, just in our lab. There were smart people, but we didn't know Kubernetes, and it was months before we really had things up and going, and felt like we were just even starting to know what we were doing. And we still get surprised and learn every day, it seems. And so why put yourself through that? So what we see is couple reasons. One is a lot of these solutions, and we were talking just a minute ago about the linkage to cloud. I mean, a lot of the solutions need to be able to run cloud, edge, wherever. So having these containerized workloads, solves a huge problem. I think Adnan talked earlier about, going to a microservices-based architecture. So the complexity of the systems that people are trying to build today, are driving them away from, legacy, monolithic software to microservices-based to containers. So they've got the flexibility, and then once you're there, it's like, okay, now I want to be able to run, many different services and have flexibility, and is therefore now I need orchestration. So I think it's a little bit like the frog in the boiling water. It's like, I need this, I need this, I need this. And pretty soon you look around and say, wow, okay, yeah, I know how I got here, but wow, this is a really complex system. One of the things that we're trying to do, getting back to participant 558's question, to try to solve some of the complexity. One of the things that we've explored with our customers that's really seems to resonate is to be able to pre-install, pre-provision these clusters. So, again, our customers, these machines, these Kubernetes clusters are going to end up at a location where there are not experts. And so to the extent that we can move that complexity back into our factories and actually pre-provision. And so rather than shipping machines to a grocery store or a restaurant and then sending an expert that starts downloading Kubernetes and starts configuring things, and a couple of days later it is done, it's very expensive, it's not very scalable. So we're have developed is the capabilities to do those things in-house in the factory. So now instead of shipping boxes and an expert, we can ship a rack of, like I said, for us, these typically are small clusters anyway. You send a rack of 3 or 4 machines that have already been pre-provisioned. We've already set up the networking. We've already provisioned them into Kubernetes and ship that, so that as near as possible, the goal is to make it more of a turnkey solution. So it feels more like it would in the cloud, where you can go and say, great, I want to provision the cluster, and a few minutes later, I'm ready to go. That's the goal that we have, is to try to move that complexity, back into the factory and away from the customer.
Okay. So we've talked about a lot of kind of nice things, I guess. And speaking of the complexity, maybe here's a question for Adnan then. What's been like super hard? Like, what hasn't worked? Like, what do you look back and say, well, that was a painful lesson?
So yes, good question. So I think, some of the things were around the whole kind of DevOps, right? The sort of automation. What we realized is you really need a solid sort of your supply chain and your automation around DevOps, CI/CD. You really need a robust model around deployments to Kubernetes. And one of the things we're looking at right now is the push versus the pull, right? Moving towards a true GitOps model. Because what we've realized is in sort of the push model, the sort of synchronous, there are benefits in terms of that it's simpler. But then when you've got a number of Kubernetes clusters and you're trying to scale deployments in numerous pods, sometimes that can have challenges, right? You consume cycles basically on your CD, versus if you had a pull model, right, that allows for more seamless deployment and keeping things lightweight. So, there's been some challenges on that front. We talked about some of the developer, challenges we had, really getting everyone up to sort of, understand how do I really design and develop an application for, it took us a while to get there. You can't just take your application that was running locally and put it in a container and just run it, right? There is a sort of an upgrade. There's a modernization effort there. The other thing I would say that we've kind of learned is you need to be careful with abstraction frameworks, right? So sometimes you get, again, speaking from a development perspective, right? So you have, for example, Spring Cloud Kubernetes, which integrates with the Kubernetes API and sort of streamlines and simplifies things from an app dev perspective, right? So how you handle configs, how you handle secrets, how you enable, your liveness and probes and stuff becomes really simple. But what you've done is you've introduced a dependency with Spring Cloud, And now if they decide to change their API, you're kind of at their mercy, right? And this has happened to us. So we used it because it gave us a very seamless experience. But when Spring Cloud 2, for example, came out, they completely deprecated the features. Well, what that meant was we needed to go back and re-engineer our apps, right?
Oof.
Now you got to do all those, right? So
Yeah.
it would have been, yes, maybe harder up front when we did things more Kubernetes native way versus relying on some of these abstraction frameworks, right? So I think that has been also sign of eye-opener. We've learned that, hey, in future, we need to be consideration. What if they change it, right? Especially around the open source projects. That is something that we've kind of learned the hard way, but we're learning, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, vendors is look. It's great for vendors like us because we can keep selling you things, I guess. Right, but at some point, right, we gotta get absolute for you too, as you know. But no, I mean, at some point, the point of all this is our businesses need to move faster. Like fundamentally, we're not doing this for our health. We're not doing this because we want our resumes to look better. We're doing this because our businesses, our employers, right? There's an opportunity to compete better. There's an opportunity to essentially, increase the value of the business that we are part of by moving faster than the competition. This is end of the day, this is a competitive advantage play, right? And to that end, technology is the assist. It's not the end. It's the means to the end, right? And so long as we remember that, I think we'll recognize that if indeed this is a means to an end, I need to find the simplest path to that end. Right, so it's truly, shortest path first, right? SPF applies here. So if you can find the best path forward, we will do it. And sometimes that comes at the cost of, hey, let me try Spring Cloud because that's easy, right? That gets me up and running. But then there's consequences of doing that also. Yeah, there's a little bit of a, to use the words used before about push versus pull. There's a push pull here. When it comes to selecting technology, do we pick the easiest path or do we pick the pragmatic path? And how can you know when you start? And this is my experience as we sell our solution. Now you know what we do, but for the audience here, I haven't actually introduced what Rafay does. Rafay is in the Kubernetes operations business. Our customers are enterprises who are modernizing their stacks, and they look at the Kubernetes problem and they say, if there was a magic wand where I can just wave the wand and the operations problem around Kubernetes sort of kind of goes away, that's the job, right? So that's how we help our customers. And because of the job that we have signed up for, we get to see everybody's complexity, right? So we mostly get calls when things are falling apart, right? Or when it's somebody who's sort of taking a front foot approach. It's when people are kind of thinking out loud. So we talk to Adnan when he says, hey, I'm looking at this new thing. Hey, what do you guys got? And then we have a theoretical conversation about how to solve a problem, right? So we're seeing it from both ends, people who are being kind of front-footed around technology, and then people who are sort of hair on fire, now what do I do? I'm stuck. So I just, it's fascinating to me to see how this market is evolving, but I will say that something has changed in our industry over the last 12 months or so. The market is moving a lot faster. The pace at which enterprises are modernizing their stacks, it's crazy. I mean, it's happening at a very massive scale. So certainly, I think, in my opinion, I'm speaking anecdotally because this is just my own data. I think we've hit an inflection point in our industry now, where I don't meet an enterprise who says, "Yeah, we're not looking at this. Kubernetes is not in our future." I just don't meet them. Right? Or the ones who used to say that a year ago, well, this is really complicated. We're going to do true Lambda, or we're going to just stick with Docker, and it doesn't exist anymore. It's gone, right? Because people have understood now the value. Yes, there's pain. Absolutely, there's pain. No question, there's pain. But it outsets the value that the business actually gets to extract from this modernization journey and from Kubernetes operations. So it's look, this has been a great conversation. I do want to ask both of you gentlemen, are there things that you want to call out that maybe I haven't asked you that you think the audience should know about?
I guess I would just say, reiterate what you were just saying, Haseeb. It does feel like we've hit an inflection point in the last year. We've been looking at this for a few years. It feels like, at least I would say particularly in retail, I don't know if it was COVID that got things started, but all of a sudden, we started out in this area of Kubernetes and edge compute, saying, "Gee, I wonder if there's a market there. Is anybody going to be interested? How do we go explain to them what we're selling and why they should be interested?" And it very quickly, I would say in the last 6 months, it's flipped to where now it's like we show up there like, yeah, how fast can you deliver? Right? Now it's like, yeah, we figured it out. We're doing it. How fast can we get there? And I think the other thing that I'll point out, you asked earlier about, why, why take on the complexity of Kubernetes. I think also once you get there, the thing that we're seeing is then the agility for these businesses going forward. Once there's a big energy barrier to get over, but once I've got cameras and compute and scalable compute and a way to manage it in, say, my stores or my restaurants, now I have tremendous flexibility to scale and add additional services. I think about, for instance, if this all had been in place before we went into COVID, how quickly and easily would it have been to come up with services to do things like, gee, I want to count the number of people in the store. Are they wearing masks? Do they have a fever? Those are all services that could have been developed and deployed very rapidly, whereas, as it turned out, that was nearly impossible to do those sorts of things. So I think it's definitely, we're definitely, I think, have hit the knee of the curve here, and things really seem to be taking off.
Adnan, any thoughts?
No, just basically reiterate kind of what you said, Haseeb, and Bruce also, right? The operational impact of, again, operating Kubernetes clusters at scale is not a trivial problem. You might be using a managed service like EKS, but that's only one very small element of the control plane, right? There's a lot more that goes to it, all the way from, creating those clusters, maintaining those clusters, day 2 operations, updates, central dashboards. So, what has worked for us is having, a good partner, right, in that, who is responsive to our needs, and who can help us from that operational aspect, but also work closely with us, right, in the day-to-day. So we're learning, right? Again, we have a small team, but, they've learned quite a bit, right? Just kind of working with someone who brings that sort of partner type spirit, so.
Sorry, who's this partner you're speaking of?
But
there's a question that came out. I think that's more of a comment. I'll read it out. This is with participant 66. How do you manage changing versions of Kubernetes? Say you have 50 teams deploying apps on Kubernetes, and you are saying to them to be ready to deploy on a new Kubernetes version. And this is actually I love having this conversation because it happens a lot. And if you allow me, I'll answer it. So it happens all the time, participant 66. Here's what I see happen in our customer environments. Most customers are not jumping to the latest version of Kubernetes instantly. It takes time. They take a couple of months, 2-3 months, because you have time, right? Right now on balance, there are 3 versions of Kubernetes coming out. In fact, every time there's a new version coming out, notice that the 1.23.1 is not the stable one. So it takes time, right? There are bugs, right? So nobody steps up front. In fact, one of the things we provide as Rafay is we have a team that their job is sort of this matrix testing. So they do a lot of testing with the latest version to make sure it's actually stable, and then make it available to our customers. Hey, press a button, upgrade. So that takes time. But even when you upgrade, not all of your internal teams may be ready to go to the new Kubernetes version, because, as Adnan mentioned, sometimes things get deprecated, right? So you got to be careful. And what we're seeing is many teams end up, because they're under pressure and they can't move fast enough, end up sort of having their own clusters. So we are seeing a cluster sprawl because of Kubernetes kind of version parity, right? So if you can't keep up with the Kubernetes version train that your enterprise is running, well, maybe we should just give you your own cluster. But then, hey, please be sure to upgrade within the next 3 months. So now one team's going to have an exception, a second team's going to have an exception, a third team's going to have an exception. You can have many clusters. It's okay. it's completely okay, so long as you have the right tooling in place to manage the life cycle of these clusters and manage the access to these clusters and so on. You can truly think of them as a fleet. It's not a bad thing, because in the grand scheme of things, if you think about it, most of these managed Kubernetes offerings in the cloud, EKS, AKS, etc., the cost of running the control plane is basically zero. It's 10 cents an hour in AWS, and I believe for AKS in Azure, it's zero. Right, so it's free. You're paying for the compute, right? So whether you have your own clusters or not, you're paying for the compute anyway, assuming these are production applications and you're gonna run node groups. So it's okay for people to not be on the same Kubernetes version, so long as you are able to manage a fleet of clusters. So that's what I am seeing happen across the board in the enterprise space, partly within 66. And Adnan, do you agree?
Yeah, and that was a really good question, because I mentioned the concept of we were using these Helm charts, right, for Spring Boot. Obviously, those charts are referencing a service YAML, they're referencing an HPA, they're referencing a deployment YAML. Those APIs will change, and we've learned where the API was deprecated. So we had to instill this team that I mentioned that kind of looks at these, who's maintaining these charts. To your point about where you're doing all this matrix testing, we are also looking at that, right? So as we're maintaining these charts, there was a conscious effort made to lifecycle management, right, of these artifacts. You cannot just deploy it once and just sort of, hey, this will self-manage, right? There needs to be a conscious part on some team to sort of keep looking at that, right? So that's another sort of complexity factor of Kubernetes, right? You are going to have API changes, but as an org, are you prepared for that, right? Not just from an op, but also from a deployment perspective. So, it doesn't end. And for a few years, I'm sure this whole market will be a sort of choppy. But I certainly see this as the reverberations are sort of idling out. Right, this market is actually. I think 2 years from now, there's maturity in this market, like true maturity in this market. The pace at which this is going, I think 2 years is going to be enough for everybody to be basically on the same page, which is great, right? I mean, having been working on various technologies for a long time now, the pace at which this market is moving relative to other things that at least I've seen in my career, it's amazing, right? So, and I think it's happening because this is one technology set that, for the most part, is being driven by the application requirements, not from sort of IT side of the house. Right, so that ties back directly to the business value. Applications tie back to business, which is why things are moving that fast. It's great. I think if we came back and talked again in 6 months, the three of us, I think we will talk about the same upsides, but fewer of the downsides, because the market is actually kind of solving them so fast. Yeah. We have 3 minutes on the clock, so I want to be mindful of time for everybody. So if anybody on the Q&A here have any questions on the chat, please type them out. I'll kind of pause for 10-15 seconds here to see if there's any other questions. All right, so with that, Adnan, Bruce, thank you so much. I'll just put up a slide so that everybody knows who Bruce and Adnan are. And Bruce and Adnan, if somebody had any questions for you directly, where can they find you?
Email's easy, bruce.blaho@hp.com.
Yeah, and I'm on LinkedIn, so certainly I welcome the community. So if there's any things that we can help, I can help answer. Certainly, I think we have to rely on each other, because again, this is such a dynamic and complex landscape, right? So anyone can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to respond and connect.
Yeah, likewise.
I'm on LinkedIn as well, Twitter, wherever you guys can find us. My email is haseeb@rafay.co. And with that, I'll ask Mr. Brown to come back and sort of take us out.
Well, thank you so much, Haseeb. I'd like to remind our audience that the session was recorded. You can find it on Container Journal website at containerjournal.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section. Before we close out, we do have some gift cards to give away. For 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, our first winner is Terry B. Our second winner is Harold N. Our third winner is Blake M. And our fourth and final winner is Kathy G. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Keep an eye on your email to claim that gift card. And if you don't see an email, just check your spam folder. So Haseeb, Bruce, and Adnan, thank you all so much for leading this fireside discussion here with us today. I would like to thank Rafay Systems for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this full hour presentation. Please, we just ask one more moment for you to fill out the post-webinar survey. And we hope to see you at a future Techstrong Learning webinar. Everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Adnan, Bruce.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having us.